Welcome back, everybody. In today's video, I'm going to show you exactly, and I mean exactly, how I'm fitting 35-inch tires on my Gen 3 Montero. And when I say I'm fitting them, I mean like I run them every day. I have no rubbing issues. I off-road it. I daily drive it. I do everything with it. This isn't just bolted on and it works for a picture or works for Instagram. This is an actual setup that I'm running, and I want to show you how I'm pulling it off. I'm going to talk about the trimming, the exact lift specifications, the exact tire specifications, every single thing I've done to make this a reality. So before we get too far into it, let's talk about the wheels and tires. Now, this has been through a couple winters, and so everything is a little chipped. The wheels, they need a repaint. The bumper needs a repaint. It's pretty dirty in here, but either way, I want to show you guys what I'm working with. So let's start with the wheels. These are Toyota 4th Gen 4Runner takeoff wheels. I'm not sure about the exact models that these came off of, but these are normally black and chrome, and all I've done is paint them rattle can red. I really kind of like this metallic cherry red. I think it pops. Some people like it, some people don't. I don't care because it's my car. But this is a Toyota wheel. It's got the 6-on-5.5 lug pattern, so that bolts up. And you can see here, I've got plenty of space between the hub on the Mitsubishi and then the inner center bore on the Toyota wheel. These are 106, and you can run a spacer here. However, I found because they are OEM wheels, because they actually come from Toyota, they're actually so well made that the lugs will center it just fine. I don't have any weird shaking issues on the highway with these wheels. They are 17s, and I believe they are 7.5 inches wide. That's kind of helpful. The exact specs I'll put up here on the screen because I don't have them memorized, but that's going to be helpful when you're thinking about offset, because these wheels are not that severely offset. If you're unfamiliar with wheel specs and the way that offset works, basically the higher number offset, the more it sits in, the lower number, even negative numbers, the more it sits out. And as you can see here, the fitment is almost exactly flush as you go down the vehicle. In the front, if you look down, there's just a little bit of sidewall, and in the back, it's about the same. The fitment is pretty much dialed if you want it to be flush. So that's the wheel. Now let's talk about the tire. I've been running BFG KO2s for the entire life of this vehicle, basically. I love them. I think they're the perfect on-road and off-road tire, but I chose these tires specifically because they're actually Ford Raptor takeoffs. I think, I could be wrong, but I think actually some Jeeps run these as well. It's this specific size and this specific rating. So I have 315, 70, 17s. That's the actual size. That's 35 by 12.5 roughly. Some people will say they're more like a 34.5, whatever. That's gonna be the size. 315, 70, 17, and it's a load range C. I wanted to make a small correction here. These are actually off of a Jeep Wrangler, which is why they are C rated. The E rated tires are the ones that come off the Ford Raptor, and I could really run both, but I prefer to run the C because it's just a little bit softer. Now, I don't do a ton of heavy hauling with this. The most I ever haul with it is maybe 2,000 pounds. The vehicle does weigh a lot, but having that softer tire makes the ride so much better. So it's a big tire, but the reason I like these is because, like I said, they are factory takeoffs. And that means I'm finding these on Facebook Marketplace, Craigslist, or even at some tire shops for dirt cheap. Most of these guys, they run them for a little bit, then they want to upgrade. You can see how much life is left on these. These are probably at least half. I've been running them for a while, maybe even a little more. And I think I got these for 50 bucks a tire. So it's a very, very cheap way to run 35s. And like I said, I already love the BFG KO2. You can see on the inside how everything's sitting here. I will dive way more in depth because I'm actually going to be pulling out this suspension, redoing this suspension, and that's a great time to show you guys everything that goes into fitting this, both in the front and the rear. So with that, there's my wheel and tire package. I'm going to get that pulled off, and then I'm actually going to remove the strut. I'm going to drop the car down and show you guys what this setup looks like at full bump. So that's when then everything is completely compressed. How does this fit? Because it's one thing to fit it here static, and it's a whole other thing to fit it when you're actually cycling the suspension up and down. So as you can see here, here's the tire all the way dropped down. And so I've removed the strut. And so the whole assembly is compressed on the bump stop back there. It's pretty well smashed. This is the whole weight of the vehicle. It's not touching the ground, but it's also not supported anywhere else. And this gives you a good opportunity to see just how tight this fitment is. Now the wheel is turned just ever so slightly towards the passenger side, and it does hit. It rubs a little. I could trim this back more if I was really concerned about it. However, in the real world, I'm not hitting this, whether it's the shock that limits it or something else. I'm just not getting this low, but you can see this thing is tucked in there. So all that trimming, all that moving things around, it really does fit perfect. And remember, this is a 12.5-inch wide tire. And so it barely fits in that wheel well. What happens is if this does hit, this fender will actually pop out. It'll break a mounting spot on the headlight, and then you can kind of lose this trim and stuff. But there you go. That's what the fitment looks like on the passenger side with it fully dropped down. And it's not all that different over here on the driver's side. You can see I'm touching just barely in the back here because again, it's turned. So obviously if I went around a corner and my wheels were turned and I fully compressed, I would hit. However, that's just not that likely in the real world. Most of the time when you're hitting something fast, you're doing a fast compression like this, you are going straight, or at least you should be. Now that I've showed you all of that, I'm gonna go ahead and jack it back up. I'm gonna reinstall my struts and show you exactly what I've got going on as far as other suspension components inside of here. So let's talk about strut packages. The first thing I want to point out is these are Bilstein 4600s. This is the shock that I've been running pretty much since I upgraded this, and I really like them. I think that they're my favorite pick. There are other brands out there. This is the one I like the most. And so I want to show you what I'm working with here. This is the new shock assembly, new strut assembly that I'm putting in. And then I'll show you some differences between them, some options, and I'll explain later how those options might affect your ride. So the first thing is new shock. All that's going in. I've got new rubbers on though, all on there. All of these I got from Lusso Overland. Here's the part number for the shock itself, or the strut assembly. And then I've got Old Man Emu medium duty springs on here. So these are the medium duty. They are not the HD. I like the medium duty. I've heard a lot of people say the HD give them too much lift and it's too stiff. I wasn't looking for that. And so these are the medium duty springs on the Bilstein 4600s. I've got all OEM. So these are Mitsubishi rubbers here, and then the bushings in the top. And that brings me to this spot right here. So I'm doing this one-handed, so obviously it's a little hard, but this is a custom lift plate that I've made. Now, this isn't super uncommon, but the fact that I made it myself is just kind of speaking of when I did this lift, because now Lusso Overland offers some of these. They're a little different in size. So let me show you what this is and why I went with this. So this is just a disc that I've drilled 4 holes into, 3 for the mounting bolts and 1 for the top of this shock tower, because it actually sticks up just a little bit proud here. And so you need that hole, otherwise everything runs into that shaft. And so I just drilled holes using this as a template. I actually stabbed this into some cardboard and you can see exactly where the holes are. Drill these holes, make sure they're big enough. And this is 5/16. I'll explain why I went with this rather than doing some other things later, but this is 5/16 thick. I believe the ones that Lusso Overland sells are 1/4 inch. Honestly, not that different. They'd probably be about the same. But back when I made this, he didn't offer that. So this just goes right on top there. It bolts in between the shock body, or the strut body, and the body of the car. So it actually sits in between. The chassis of the car would be right here. These bolt holes go through, put nuts on top. This sits on top, and it gives it just a little more lift without changing the spring rate. In order to accommodate that, I also have these top hat nuts. I'll show you these when they go on the vehicle. These are just a little bit thinner than the ones that come on the factory. These are also 5/16 of an inch thick. And honestly, I don't know if these are necessary, but it allows me to get it just a little further on there. Obviously, if you had a different nut, it would just stick up more. But I think this maybe is for a clearance issue. I can't honestly remember why I did this, but I want to show you guys exactly what I'm running. And so that's it. So to go over it again, I've got these top nuts. These are 5/16. This 5/16 plate with 4 holes drilled in it, medium duty spring, OEM bushings, and a Bilstein 4600 for the actual strut assembly. One thing I wanted to point out here, this is my old strut body, and you can see the Bilsteins actually come with an adjustable clip under here. This is a circlip, and this is what changes the height of this bottom mounting point. And so you have about 10 millimeters difference between this spot and this spot. And what that does is it increases the preload of the spring. So it actually crunches the spring a little more, and it's going to give it a little more of a stiff feel. It's going to change the spring. It doesn't change the spring rate, but it changes the way a spring rate is affected, and it gives you a little more lift, because as this goes under more pressure, it actually pushes up on the car more, because this gets stronger, this spring gets stronger, and actually push up on the vehicle. I'm sure somebody is going to annihilate me in the comments and say that's not exactly how it works, but functionally, if you move this, you get lift, because this spring acts like a more heavy duty spring. There's also a difference between the medium duty and the HD, but the biggest difference I can find is actually length. So when you add the HD spring, at least for the Old Man Emu, it's just a little bit longer, which means you're just compressing it more on this shock body. And so it actually increases the preload. And so you can accomplish a similar thing by moving this circlip up. So let me explain how this would affect your ride differently than maybe having a top hat like I have here. So ultimately, I decided to drop it down from this point to this point. It just softens up the ride a little bit, and I got the lift I needed with this. I'll show you how this fits in the car when I install it, but there's a couple things worth considering. I think 5/16 is the absolute most you could possibly put on this car without running into issues. So let me get this installed, and I'll show you guys what I'm working with. So here's the new strut assembled, and I wanted to show you guys exactly what I was talking about when I said I think this is the absolute biggest spacer you can fit. And up here you can see the spacer just barely. From the outside you wouldn't know the difference, which is honestly kind of nice. Sometimes these lift kits, obviously not this much of a lift kit, but if you can even call this a lift kit, they'll have this giant spacer here and it looks terrible, and honestly I get worried about the torque on it. And so this is actually really clean. You would never know it's there, which is why I thought while I have this out, it'd be really good to show you guys that 5/16 plate. So here we are, we're assembled, and I've got everything bolted up, everything is tight, and I wanted to show you exactly why I think this is all I can fit in here, is that 5/16 plate. As you move this down, it changes the angle in which it interacts with this upper control arm. It's gonna be kind of hard to see, but right there, you can see there is barely any space between the actual shock body and this control arm. And so what happens, and I've done this before, is if you put a bigger plate in here, if you put something like a 1/2 inch or bigger, it actually moves everything around, and this arm will actually hit the body. Now, on occasion, I imagine that this will flex enough that it might bump it just a little, but it's not going to do any damage, and it's definitely not going to repetitively hit it. And so I think after a lot of trial and error, this is the ideal situation where I get just enough space here to give it some lift, but it doesn't hit. Anything more than that, I would not recommend. You're gonna have to do custom upper control arms or cut and weld this, which if you want to, that's fine. But that's my experience, so I wanted to show you that. Now let me go up top and show you those top hat mounting bolts. So here's the top hat mounting bolts, and I actually remembered why I put these in. It's not necessarily because they're thinner, because you can see the bolt sticks up, but the original ones had a little bit of a gap where there wasn't threads when it went on, and that was really annoying. So I just picked these up. I don't think this is necessary. If you're able to get the threads all the way to the bottom, that's the key. So the other one where it had that little bit of gap before the threads showed up, I would get it nice and tight, but the engagement was actually less than it is with these, because these go all the way to the bottom, so they actually hold it a little more securely. Ideally, there's not a lot of weight or force on these, so it's not super crucial. This has been totally fine for 100,000 miles for me, but that's what I'm running on the top. As far as other components in here that contribute to a lift kit, the first thing I'll say is this is a 20-year-old car. So if you're lifting this and it has OEM components, it doesn't matter if you put a new lift spring in. There's going to be other things that are sagging and affecting it. And so it's worth noting, I'm going to go through exactly what I have in here. And it doesn't mean you have to do exactly the same, but if you have saggy bushings, your lift dimensions are going to change even if you replace this strut assembly. So in all the corners, I have polyurethane bushings. I have Siberian bushings up here in the upper control arms. That's my recommendation. The way that they bolt in is better than the polytough, or the way they press in, I should say, is better than the polytough. I've had good luck with these upper control arms here in the front now that I switched to that. But down below, I do have the polytoughs, and that's because there's an eccentric bolt that moves and that adjusts the camber. And the polytough bushings are way better for that because they don't lock up. So these will always be able to move. And so if you've watched some of my other videos, tires, you know, that these can seize. And so I eliminated that by putting in those poly-tough bushings. That way I could still get that adjustment. I also have a sway bar bushing. That really doesn't matter for lift. And I have new upper and lower ball joints. They're obviously very dirty, but I replaced them just last year. These are relatively new as well. And so those are all the components I have up here that make up my lift kit. Well, I have this wheel bolted up and at full droop. I wanted to show you guys the difference between full droop and full compression. And this is a rough estimate because the fender is, you know, it was kind of tucked into the fender here. But I would say I have about 8 inches of travel here in the front when it's fully drooped. So that's pretty good, actually, for an independent suspension, at least I think. So about 8 inches of travel between the wheel at full droop and full compression. I want to show you guys a quick shot of the bump stops that I'm using. They are available at lusooverland.com. They're a pretty generic bump stop. I honestly didn't do a whole lot of research other than figuring out if they're going to work for this, but they seem to work great. So they are a little taller than the stock ones. You can see there's a couple more ribs up there and they're a different shape. And so I think they're more progressive, but those have worked pretty well to limit my travel. So I've got the new strut assembly in here and it's all buttoned up. Now I want to talk about trimming. So in the front, I have done a considerable amount of trimming. I can't tell you 100% if all of it's necessary, but what I can tell you is with my current configuration, with a good alignment, with this shock package and this trimming, I am not rubbing at all. And I jump this thing and I take it off road and I do all sorts of stuff with it and I haven't had any issues. So I'm going to show you what's going on with this. If you want to cut this severely, that is totally up to you. So let's start with the front. Yes, I have an aftermarket bumper, and by aftermarket, I mean I built it myself. So it's very high clearance. You could do some cutting with the stock bumper and probably end up like this, or you could just take off the other bumper and have it be like this. This definitely helps with my approach angle, but also it just means I haven't been concerned about anything up front. So if you have the traditional bumper that hangs down here, you might have some issues with rubbing and have to cut pretty aggressively, but this is how I got away with it. You can see all the way up to here, I've removed everything in this realm, and then I've completely removed my splash guard. So all of the mud that comes off of this tire just goes straight back into here. It's not ideal, but every single time I tried to configure something to go here, I ended up ripping it out. As you'll see, this tucks all the way up into here. So my tire actually hits this part of the unibody, and so it has to go all the way up here. And so I've tried to tuck these wires up higher, but at this point, I've been running it like this for about 4 years, and I haven't had any issues. Same on the other side. Even though the wiring harness is here, I just wrapped it in some rubber, and it's been okay. So I don't have any fender liners, which means, yes, dirt and grime gets everywhere. You got to be careful about rust. You get some buildup right here, but that's how I got rid of the rubbing on the fender liners. And then for the actual fender, you can see I have cut back quite a bit of the plastic. So this normally hangs over and there's a lip that comes here from the actual metal fender that comes, and there's rivets here, and I have cut all of that. And so there's maybe a ½ inch of material, and on the outside you can't really tell that it's been cut. I didn't cut up into this, I just cut back, and I didn't want to cut flush because then you can kind of see that exposed edge. So I cut right at the round, and as you see, as you back up, it doesn't look cut, but then you come in here and I've removed all of this. I've trimmed this back, and most of this was looking at the line that the tires left and finding out how far I could go this way before I got to the part where it would start to look crappy. So I just cut all that out with an angle grinder, and then I went in, and this will be a little harder to see, but I actually cut up on the metal fender as well. You can see this is where the plastic rivets in, and I've cut above that. I could cut more aggressively, however, I haven't needed to because it will hit this plastic fender before it hits the metal fender. So I've cut that up, maybe you can see a finger's width, that's maybe a ½ inch above that. And then I've painted that edge, and then I've put some kind of protective rubber over that, as well as back here. So here's what it looks like in the front. Again, it goes all the way through, and I've cut back that metal fender, cut it back fairly aggressively, removed as much as I could without it looking like it's been hacked up. And that allows the clearance that I need. Now, these do flex a little bit. I haven't noticed anything. They're not like flapping around in the wind. And it's kind of nice to have that flex. If for some reason I do hit that bump stop, this flexes a little more than brakes. So let's talk about right back here. This is a big issue when if you run wide wheels, wide tires like I'm running, you get a lot of clearance issues here on any vehicle. And so I've done a few things. The first one is I've done sliders. So I've completely removed the stock running boards and I've replaced them with this, and I've cut this back pretty far. You can see it pretty much goes right to that pinch weld and then it stops. And so that's what I've done to get away with that. You could just remove the running boards and have the clearance, but then this also comes to about right here from the factory. And so I've cut a considerable amount, maybe 4 inches out of this. Again, I use this as a guide, this pinch weld coming down. Also, I apologize, this is so dirty, but you guys just get to see this is what it looks like. So I used this pinch weld coming down, and then I went up and over, and I've actually come back quite a ways as well. So this actually angles back towards the rear of the vehicle and comes around, and you can see one of my plastic rivets here has already popped out. So anyways, that bolts in right there. I left that mounting point and came all the way back pretty much as far as I could to come around. And then there are some mounting points down here for that plastic or for the metal fender. I've kept those as well. So I got that one, and that actually bolts the bottom side of the metal part of the fender to the chassis of the vehicle. So I've kept all of those mounts, but I've cut this back as far as I could. Again, I don't know if this is 100% necessary, but what I do know is this is out of the way. I'm not rubbing it at all. I want to talk about this for a second as well. As you can see here, this is when I started to put 35s on. You can see a little bit of rubbing on the inside of this subframe. Now that's not ideal because you can't move the subframe. You can't do a whole lot to get out of that. It's when it was turning full lock to the passenger side. And the reason this was happening is actually because my alignment was bad. So I had these jam nuts. One of these tie rods was way further than the other. So I was actually getting more steering angle going the passenger way than I was the driver. And that's because I removed the steering rack, removed the tie rods, even removed the steering wheel, did a bunch of stuff. And when I put it back in, it wasn't quite centered. So getting an alignment is absolutely key to making sure you can run 35s. And now that I've got this aligned, now that it's centered, I do not rub here anymore. So this is not an issue, but this is the only spot I was actually rubbing when I switched from 33s to 35s. So there's the front suspension. I went over the coil springs I'm using, the shocks I'm using, the bushings you can see in there, and all of the trimming and some of the modifications like the bumper and the sliders. All of that fits so that I can fully stuff a 35-inch tire on this wheel offset. It works well for me. I'm not saying that you have to do it. If you want to fit 35s, you can cut a lot more. You might be able to cut a lot less, but that's exactly how I'm fitting it in this Gen 3. So looking back in the rear, I've got a couple things going on here that I want to talk about. The first one, let's talk about the spring and shock package. This is an Old Man Emu HD spring. I've had these on here for a while. If you're looking for the part number, I believe it's OME 918X. And so I've got those in both sides, and I have these polytough bushings on the lower part and the top. And the top one is a little thicker. I can't seem to find them right now. And so I think it's a 1/2 inch thicker or maybe 10 millimeters thicker. And so it gives it a little more lift here in the rear. And so these are the most heavy duty shocks, or sorry, these are the most heavy duty springs from Old Man Emu. And I find that they do a good job of keeping the weight up. I have quite a bit of weight in this car, and so I've needed these. They give me a good amount of lift. I don't find them to be too heavy duty. I find them to be just right. And then again, I've got the Bilstein shocks in the rear. These ones are non-adjustable, so you just put them in. I like the way these ride. They haven't given me any issues, and so I've run these now for 2 shock changes in a row. I want to talk about bushings too a little bit. Like I mentioned, having good bushings is essential if you're going to do 35s, if you're going to lift your car, if you're going to put big tires on it. But these are some Siberian bushings. I really like these in the upper control arms. These ones have held up great for me. I do have a polytough bushing up here, and then I have some white line off-center bushings for this toe arm. Now, I'm not huge on these off-center bushings. For a little while, I was trying to correct some toe problems that I was having in the rear, and so I went with these. However, after looking at it, these actually don't really make a difference for my setup. Now that I'm getting good alignments, now that everything is kind of refreshed, all these bushings are refreshed, I don't think they're necessary. So some people have asked me about them. I would just go with polytough ones because the polytough ones allow you to still adjust on the rear. And so that's why I have them in the toe. And then I also have them back here on the lower control arm. So these are polytough as well. And then I've got Siberian ones inside of the hub. Now, as far as trimming goes, things are a little bit different. You can see here just a little bit that I've trimmed out the inside plastic, and it's not all that much. I basically saw where it was rubbing and I cut. However, there's not very much of a gap right here, and so you can't get that much clearance from it, but I cut that. I did not do a whole lot on the inside here. There's been a little bit of hammering done where I pushed it back just a touch, but barely anything. The back doesn't suffer from the same issues as the front because you don't turn. And then obviously right here, I've cut this off. This is actually more of an aesthetic thing. I cracked the bumper, so I didn't have to cut this for clearancing. However, I did have to change the mud flap up a little bit when I put the bigger tires on because it was rubbing in the back. So I got rid of the mud flap, but all of this cutting, that's mostly just aesthetic. That's not functional. The other thing I want to talk about is bump stops. I do have a 1/2 inch spacer in this factory bump stop that helps this not hit the top. Because the wheel sits out so much, I can't have it running up into here, and there's no way to tuck a big tire into this wheel well. It just has to be so far inset, it really wouldn't work. And so these bump stops were the only way to make sure on big compressions that I wasn't going to hit the top of that. And I actually have one of these off right now because I'm changing the upper control arm. So let me show you what that looks like off the car. So I'm swapping over these upper control arms, and I wanted to show you a closer look at what I was doing with the bump stop there. So you see here, this is the block that I made. It's made out of aluminum, and it's just a 1/2 inch thick, and it's to put the factory bump stop up a little higher. I could have got other thicker or higher bump stops, but this is what I went with back in the day, and it's worked pretty well. However, one thing I want to point out is if you're going to do this on your own, I actually ended up cutting the factory bolt. I ended up cutting a bevel into it here and welding on additional threads. Not necessarily the recommended way to do it. However, after 100,000 miles on this car, these are still holding up. So it worked for me, but that's how I was able to use the factory bump stop with a little bit of a spacer. And the reason I welded those threads on is because once you put this spacer on, you actually can't get a bolt on there. So this does go through the upper control arm, so it's a little funky. But anyways, I just want to show you, this is what I'm doing. Can't say I recommend it or don't recommend it, but this is exactly how I do the bump stops in the rear. So that's the rear end, and in a lot of ways, it's a lot more simple because you don't have the issues up front where the tire turns and it's gonna hit everything. And so getting all of this set up was easier. For me, the big thing is making sure that all of these bushings are good. I hate that this has rear independent suspension because it makes this so complicated. This could have a spring and a trailing arm and a solid axle and it would be perfect. But instead, they've got all this alignment crap, and all of these bushings have to be perfect if you're gonna run a tire this size. And so that's what I would say is having the right spring, a shock to go with it, and making sure those bushings are fresh and you can actually align it. That's what's been the key for me reliably running 35s on this Gen 3 in the rear. Now, one of the last things that is so important with my setup is a proper alignment. So you absolutely need to get a good alignment when you're fitting this much wheel and tire on this platform. If anything is even a little bit off, if your tie rods are a little skewed, if they're not quite centered, you're gonna have issues with turning. You're gonna be running into the frame, especially in the back, as I mentioned on this side. And so you've gotta make sure that you go to an alignment shop that's actually going to come in and center your steering rack. It's gonna require a little more work. And if you've done a lot of custom stuff in here, if you've, well, I guess not custom, but if you've replaced your rack, if you replaced a lot of tie rods, it can be a little bit of a pain. So make friends with your alignment guy, treat him right, let him know what you got going on. But this is set up perfectly right now. I have got this vehicle 100% aligned. It's all in the green. It isn't cupping the tires. There isn't any weird wear. And so that's pretty incredible to see. The tires are straight up and down. They're facing straight. You can actually fit these with a proper alignment. Now, the last thing I want to talk about here is actually probably one of the most important things. See, fitting 35s is one thing. Having them on the vehicle, even having the suspension cycle and not hit, that's one thing, but it really doesn't do you any good if you can't turn them. And turning them on road is completely different than turning them off road, where you're going to be a lot lower, a lot slower. And if you've ever put bigger tires on your car, especially like a Gen 3, you know they really start to suffer when you get more weight, more rotating mass, and a bigger circumference. So when I went to 33s, I immediately noticed this car was starting to feel a lot more sluggish. So I did one of my favorite modifications, which I've talked about in a few other videos. I even made a video years ago about doing the swap. I did a 4.9 gear swap. So this comes with 433s from the factory, and I moved up to 4.9. It's a pretty common modification. You got to do some hunting in a junkyard, but it is well worth it. What that does is it actually moves my gear ratio back to where it should be with the larger tires. There's a lot of math involved, but basically this is operating as if at the same mechanical advantage as if it was on the stock tire size. So that means I'm getting the same RPM it's supposed to at cruising speeds on the highway. That means it's starting off in a similar like gear ratio from a stop. And that means that I have the same kind of mechanical advantage when I'm going low and slow off-roading on the trails. And so that makes this tire and wheel package actually feasible. Like, it actually works. I'm not getting any overheating issues on the trail. It's getting pretty good gas mileage. Now, it's a Gen 3 on 35s. It's not getting amazing gas mileage, but I'm getting somewhere between 12 and 14 miles per gallon. I did a big long road trip earlier this year and I tracked it the whole way and it's working just fine. Normally, if you went up this big and then you had the 4.3s, you'd be down in like the single digits. You'd be looking at like 10 or even 9 miles per gallon just because the mechanical advantage isn't there to turn that much weight, to turn that much circumference. And so this is good. It's not great, right? Like, it's not a hybrid. I'm not hypermiling this thing, but to have this big of a tire and have that good of gas mileage, that's a pretty big win for me. Another thing I'll mention really briefly here, and I'll do another video on this, is actually this throttle pedal controller from Lusso Overland. This has been super helpful for adding some more pep to this thing when it's got 35s. It's also worth mentioning right here that a re-gear for a normal car, and I'm talking like your Fords, your Toyotas, if you're wheeling a Chevy, I suppose, it can cost thousands of dollars. I'm into this one. I think $250 for both the front and rear diff. And then I paid a guy to put an LSD in the rear, and that was like $150 for less than $500. I've re-geared this car to run 35s. That's pretty amazing. Also, when you move to 35s after coming up from a factory 4.3 and factory size tires, it actually resets the speedometer so it's accurate. So one of the things that happens a lot of time when you're running tires this big is your speedometer actually reads significantly lower, between 5 and 10%, or even in extreme cases, 15% lower, especially at higher speeds. My speedometer is dead accurate. When I'm cruising at 80 miles an hour on the highways here, it says 80 miles an hour. And that's kind of just cool. It's kind of cool that after all of the work I've done, it actually reads and acts like factory. So there you guys have it. I hope that this has been a helpful video, that I've explained almost everything you could possibly want to know about my setup, how I'm running 35s reliably, consistently. It's really, really been a good setup for me. And now that I've gone to 35s, I probably won't go back. Yes, it's a large tire, but I think it looks great. And like I said, I'm able to pull it off just fine. The alignment is good. The fitment is perfect. I'm getting good gas mileage. It's all just working. So if you guys have any other questions, let me know in the comments below. I'll do my best to answer them. And with that, I'll catch you guys on the next one.